Hi everyone, and welcome to another studio vlog. In this video, I'm gonna make some new pieces and I'm gonna go deep into some 20th century art history and see how it relates to my work. If you don't know me, my name is Brian. I'm an artist. I live in Vietnam. I do fine art. I also create t-shirt designs. This is a recent design that I've made. I just launched it in the last week or so. Go check it out. I don't yet have enough subscribers to make money from my YouTube channel, so if you'd like to support me, you could go buy me a coffee and buy me a bubble tea. I don't really like coffee that much. And links for all that stuff are below in the description. For the past several years, I've been working on a series called Permutations, where I reinterpret the same shape over and over again. I found that setting constraints for myself somehow frees me to be more experimental. Strange. So I start with 30 points and more recently 40 points. And I just use this as an initial inspiration to exploit, explore, subvert, and see what happens. Sometimes I go down little paths, and I like to call these mini-series, where I create a bunch of pieces in a row that are all related by some sort of characteristics. Recently, I made several pieces that had a sort of ethereal watercolor to them with a chaotic gestural paint pattern. And after I made these pieces, I decided that I wanted to do something that was much more vivid in color and more simple in design and sort of graphic. And so I started this series. I started with this piece here, knowing only that I wanted to use this light blue and then significantly hide it with a deep matte black. For these pieces, I'm using gouache paint. Gouache is an interesting medium. It is water-based, like watercolor, but is much more opaque. And unlike acrylic paint, it dries very, very matte. For this series, I'm using whole bean artist gouache for the colors, but for the black areas, I'm using whole bean, but it's the Acryla imprint. Acryla paints have acrylic in them, so they tend to be more resilient, and they're also water resistant after they dry, so you don't lift when applying a second layer. This black is so deep and its surface is so non-reflective that it looks like you're looking into a void. And it's one of the reasons why I really love gouache. I tried to be as spontaneous as possible with the initial compositions, just allowing the brush to explore the page. Sometimes I might have had a loose idea going into it, but I tried to be spontaneous. Once I had the general shape I was satisfied with, it was important for me to get rid of the rough edges or obvious brush strokes. In a way, I'm removing the evidence of the initial spontaneity. As with a lot of my work, this is a kind of contradictory tension, and that interests me. The more obvious contradiction in these pieces comes from the use of the geometric line work that is at the foundation of permutations. Using these calculated geometric shapes in conjunction with the freeform shapes, it creates a new sort of tension. I think these elements create the kind of complexity that give the pieces what I like to think of as a second look aspect. What I mean from that is, from a distance, the viewer gets an initial impression, and if I've done my job right, they can be satisfied or impressed with this view. But also, certain elements pull them in, and hopefully fill them with some sort of wonder about the process behind these elements. So pretty much right away, these pieces were reminding me of mid-century modern art. And as I posted them on social media, others made similar connections. So I decided to do some real research into how accurate this association was. One of the first things I discovered was that the phrase mid-century modern usually relates to architecture and furniture, and was pretty limited to the time around 1945 to 1969. The furniture design was clean, avoided frivolous details, and would sometimes incorporate amorphous shapes or elements of asymmetry. Meanwhile, the architecture often showcased building materials. It also employed clean design, and it used non-traditional and even sometimes amorphous or organic shapes. Mid-century modern has been trending in the US lately, so if you do a search of mid-century modern art, you'll get a lot of hits of people selling recently made art, but with that name. But you can see just from this search that it consists of a lot of organic shapes and geometric patterns. Wikipedia says that mid-century modern is related to modernism, which is a movement that is more about the fine arts, like painting and sculpture, but it also encompassed writing and film and music. But the modernist movement of art history takes place over a long period of time, and it's very layered and has all these different time frames, so it's a lot more complex to talk about. Depending on who you ask, you will get a different date on when modernism begins. Some say that Edouard Manet, who was active in the mid to late 1800s, with his contributions to Impressionism and his preoccupation with ordinary urban life, began the modern movement. It's also been observed that J.M.W. Turner, who has always been one of my favorite painters, was beginning to develop painting techniques that would be further explored deep into the span of modernism. The main difference was that Turner was devoted to stories and events that were either real or imagined, while the artists that came after him became interested in exploring art itself as the subject, rather than history or mythology or religion. What's important to understand is that all sorts of movements in visual art were happening in rapid succession, and they were all building on one another or overlapping, all while they were trying to reject the long-standing traditions of what it had meant to make art. Artists like Vasily Kandinsky and Piet Mondrian were exploring what it meant to just study light and color on the canvas, rather than trying to mimic the natural world. A good way of thinking about it is that modernism is a general ideology that focused around a rejection of traditionalism, but many smaller movements focused around specific techniques or philosophies grew out of modernism, such as Cubism, Futurism, Surrealism, and in the States, Abstract Expressionism, which itself had several variations. In doing research for this video, I kind of rediscovered Henry Moore, who is a prominent sculptor of modernism. There are several Moore sculptures in and around Chicago, so I kind of saw them throughout my young life, just randomly, and they kind of got absorbed into my psyche without me really knowing who it was. But the forms that I was making in these pieces kind of reminded me of his sculptures. And I think that's one of the interesting things about doing these videos on YouTube is I can really reflect on my work and then do some research and make connections that I might not have if I was just, working without making these videos. So it's kind of a cool side effect. One of the offshoots of abstract expressionism is the color field school. I always think of the artist Mark Rothko when I think of color field, and what's interesting is that most people do not find his works particularly expressionistic, and Rothko denied that they were abstract. But it just again shows you why art history is super confusing. In my research, I also found an artist named Robert Motherwell, who is considered part of the color field school, and I think the relationship between some of his work and mine is pretty clear. I don't think I was necessarily conscious of who he was or what his work looked like while I was making these pieces, but I think that the similarities are very striking. You might think that my Permutation series is heavily influenced by his way of working, especially his Elegy to the Spanish Republic series, but I swear I wasn't even aware of his work, at least on a conscious level, until I started working on this video. There's a great documentary about his work on YouTube, so I'll leave a link to that in the description below. I also watched another documentary about a bunch of American abstract painters, and I'll put that link in the description as well. Overall, I'm really happy with how this mini-series came out. I created a mock-up of several of the pieces hanging in the same space, and I think they look great this way. I've created 2 other pieces which represent minor variations in this series. In one, I used this mustard-colored watercolor for the color portion of the piece instead of gouache. The result is more texture in the color field. I also added black lines in this part, where in the other pieces there's only white lines in the black fields. So it's just more line work. The black lines are a bit narrower than the white ones, and so it's this in addition to the fact that there's less contrast between black and mustard than there is between black and white. So the mustard portions seem to recede a bit into space and makes them look further in the background. I think you'll start to see a combining of styles with this piece, and I think it's an interesting analogy in terms of art history. I've often thought about the Permutations project as being a sort of open survey of art history through the limited lens of this single shape. Anyway, I've started with a painterly stroke of white acrylic paint and then created a solid block of this minty blue. Then I add this dark blue section, which seems to interact strangely with the previous layers, which is kind of interesting and really draws attention to the materials I'm using in a way that the earlier pieces weren't doing. With only a few alterations in how I apply the paint, the color of the background, and the colors I use, this piece feels so different from the others. It reminds me of some sort of primitive totem. I think if I could go back in time and live out in any art history period, around the 1930s to the 1970s would be so exciting. The art world, especially in the United States, was so exploding with creativity and exploring, and it just seemed so cool, and anything seemed possible. I remember when I was little and going to the Art Institute, the modern wing was by far like the most interesting to me, and it's somehow comforting to me that I still have that impulse as an adult. And I don't know why that is, but to me it just feels, comforting. I hope you enjoyed this video as much as I did making it. I hope you learned a little something about art history and maybe want to do your own research, watch some videos on YouTube. As always, I welcome any comments. What did you think about this format where I kind of go into comparing other artworks to my own? Do you agree with my interpretations? Disagree? I'd really love to hear from you. I appreciate you all so much. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.